Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Steve Carter. Steve, thanks for being here, man.
Hey, thanks for having me, Chris and Nikki.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited to chat with you and hear a bit about your background and what you're up to and actually get some expertise and insight from you on the vulnerability management landscape. But before we dive down that rabbit hole, can you tell us a bit about your background, in the career and kind of what you're up to now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a co-founder and the CEO at Nucleus Security. And, if you're not familiar with Nucleus, we're really just a company that's on a mission to prevent breaches and reduce risk through the automation of risk-based vulnerability management. And I know that's a mouthful and not here to pitch the company, but that's what we do. Personally, I spent the majority of my career working for federal agencies or working with federal agencies to build and scale vulnerability management programs. So I ended up starting a managed security services company in 2015 called Rampant Technologies. And we worked with both public and private sector there. But throughout my career, I was always looking for a platform to automate a lot of these manual and time-consuming processes that are part of vulnerability management. So in 2018, decided to build Nucleus and bring that product to market that I was really always looking for and felt needed to exist. And so for the last 5 years or so, I guess, I've been building Nucleus. I was the original developer of the tool, of the platform, and now obviously much more focused on strategy and partnerships and all this other fun business stuff. So that's what I've been up to.
Awesome. Well, I'm very excited to chat with you again today. We've chatted a couple times about vulnerability management. And one of the things that, I see continuously is, and you sort of hit on it a little bit, is that vulnerability management can be really complex. There's tons of vulnerabilities and they're coming out all the time. And, how do we use scoring systems? And so it becomes really complex really quickly. And I'm curious about how you feel, because this is something I think a lot about the current state of sort of documentation, guidance. What should you do with vulnerability management? What does that mean now that we have Kubernetes and containers and everything's moving to the cloud? So besides some references out there from NIST that are, a few years old, what do you think that organizations should be doing when they're talking about a vulnerability management program and sort of looking at maturing those processes?
Yeah, this is a really, really hard problem that I think probably not enough people talk about, quite honestly, because there isn't enough good guidance out there on vulnerability management, right? We have some things from NIST, some things from CISA, but if you just like what does a good reference architecture look like for an enterprise vulnerability management program? If someone just asks that question, is looking for that answer, where do you go, right? What book do you read? What course do you take? Nikki, I know you have a course. I think it's like a 2 or 3 hour course on cyber, which is awesome, by the way. But if you're thinking of educating your team on what good looks like in the context of enterprise vulnerability management, there just aren't a ton of good resources out there. And so the folks that are really good at this are mostly just self-taught and have learned this through experience over years and years and years. And there just aren't a lot of people that are really good at developing and designing enterprise vulnerability management programs. So yeah, it's kind of a mess, right? We need more content out there. We need more courses like the one you put together, and we're actually working on one at Nucleus. Not to plug that, but yeah, the education and awareness of how to do vulnerability management well, it needs some love. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I was going to say, as an industry, and not even individuals, but as an industry, I think we have a lot of challenges around vulnerability management and the way we score and the databases we use, and we'll dive into that some of that coming up. But I want to ask you a couple other questions. One, you mentioned you came from the development background. How do you think that's played into? I'm always curious, how do you think that played into the way you approach cybersecurity, and especially with shift left, for example, and things like that? Having that development background, do you think that's helped you?
Oh yeah, it's helped a ton. I always recommend, we talk to a lot of folks that are just getting started in cybersecurity, and people that are looking for advice. If anyone ever asks me for advice that's getting started, I always say learn software well, learn to code as deeply as you can. And not everyone has the aptitude for it, and that's okay. But I think the deeper that you understand software in general, the better cybersecurity professional that you can be. Because, ultimately all of these vulnerabilities we're talking about, they're vulnerabilities in software. And so to understand them at the deepest level and defend against them, even, obviously if you want to go the offensive route, you need to know software, in the inner workings even better. So for me personally, it's been a huge help. And I've always kind of I've always kind of been in the middle there where, half of me is kind of just a software engineer at heart, and the other half a cybersecurity professional and engineer. And so that's to me, it's been a massive help. So yeah, I always recommend that.
Yeah, I imagine that would be your answer. I mean, for me, I never had a development background, so I've had to learn a lot in terms of how developers work and software engineering, how they approach these problems and things like that. So it's helped a lot to try to understand that. And I think folks who come from that background will actually be more successful in security, in my opinion, especially as we move forward and everything is as code now. The future of security is kind of codified, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And we actually, I mean, I give anytime I'm talking to younger folks, especially people entering college, I'm like, hey, learn to code, even if it's nothing to do with cybersecurity, just because, software and coding combined with another field that you want to focus on. I don't care if it's, if you want to be a chemist or if you want to be an accountant or whatever it is, just the combination is always so powerful.
Yeah, it'd be hard to argue that software is not valuable, no matter what discipline you go into at this point. I want to ask you also, how do you, having been in the career field for a while and watched the prevalence of cloud take off and DevSecOps, and obviously the push for shift left security, and talking about CI/CD tool chains and SaaS and DAS and all the tools that we try to put in the pipeline and so on. How do you think that's changed how we approach vulnerability management, or how should it change how we approach vulnerability management, knowing that we have like a complex environment, a lot of tools, a lot of different environments, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, what I see changing is organizations starting to think about vulnerability management differently, and I guess more holistically, right? Because going all the way back, it was just, hey, we're going to run some scanning tools against our, our infrastructure, and everything was very much focused kind of on that infrastructure and network side of the house. And now, at least with a lot of the folks that we're working with at Nucleus, they're thinking about things much more holistically to include, vulnerabilities and vulnerability management in the context of cloud security and their cloud security team, and in the context of product security and AppSec. And they're trying to put together, a holistic strategy and policies and SLAs that cover kind of all these different areas of, very complex enterprises. And that's really hard. And that's a work in progress for almost every organization. But that's really what I see changing most, is organizations trying to kind of, wrap their arms around all of it and try to be holistic and consistent with how they manage vulnerabilities, regardless of whether it's, in their, OT devices or in their applications or, in a cloud configuration, right? It's all just, vulnerability and risk.
Yeah, I feel like it really touches really well into my next question, because when we're thinking about vulnerability management, I feel like in the past, it's really been about, what do network defenders do, right? Like just taking this sort of reactive, okay, this vulnerability was released. Okay, what does it mean? How much time do I have to remediate? All these things, right? Whereas when you start thinking about vulnerabilities as how is someone going to use these? How is someone going to leverage them against my organization? Or what does this mean for me in my industry, right? Healthcare versus, big tech or something like that. There's different types of attacks, different vulnerabilities that are going to make more sense. So do you think organizations need to have this more customized approach to vulnerability management and not just say, okay, we've got all the vulnerabilities, just fix them all at once? Let's actually look at maybe vulnerability chaining or threat modeling, things like that.
Yeah, 100%. Right. And I think honestly, this is one of the biggest challenges relating to vulnerability management today, in my opinion, which is that a lot of organizations still really aren't aware of how critical their vulnerability management practices are to protecting their systems and data, right? And last year, well, actually, I think 2021 was the first year that vuln exploitation was the #1 technique that attackers use to compromise networks, right? Most people would think it's still credential reuse or phishing or something like that. It's vulnerability exploitation now, and vulnerability exploitation is the #1 initial access vector in ransomware as well, right? And so it's the organizations that we work with are starting. I mean, they're the ones I think that understand these things and are doing all the work to kind of modernize and adapt and optimize their vulnerability management programs, which I think is super, super important, today, just to protect against the threats of 2023. But I think a lot of organizations just don't realize some of those statistics and trends that I just rattled off, right? Which is pretty concerning.
Yeah, actually, you made me think of something I wanted to ask before I ask you my next question is, like, you talked about that vulnerability exploitation. As an industry, we seem to be pretty terrible at like patching vulnerabilities, even if they're known to be exploited and have a patch available. Why do you think organizations struggle with that? You have like a 2-year-old vulnerability with a patch available for 18 months that gets exploited. Why do you think organizations struggle with patching, known exploited vulnerabilities, for example?
Oh man, we could talk about this one for hours, right? So many reasons. I mean, the first couple things that come to mind, of course, are most large enterprises are still trying to get a handle on asset inventory and asset management, and just understanding what they actually have. And this kind of you could get into software inventory and SBOM and everything else being a part of that. So you've got challenges there, and there have been a lot of like technologies that have come along to help you with that. But then you also have, let's see, that I would say, and this is, it might sound self-serving, but it is a challenge when your average large enterprise has something like, anywhere from 12 to like 20 or more different vulnerability scanning tools. And so you've got all of these silos of all of these databases of vulnerability information. They're all rating things differently. They're all giving you different information. And they're all, isolated, and in most cases, people don't have all the information they need, right? If I own, a fleet of computers, or if I'm a product manager of, a bunch of applications, like where do I go to see everything, all the vulnerabilities from all of the different tools that we're using that are associated and impacting the things that I own, right? There's not a ton of technology and tools out there to really help you bring it all together and just answer that question, right? Or if maybe I don't own it, maybe I just have responsibility for fixing things, and just answering that question across all of these different sources of vulnerability information, whether it's a pen test, whether it's a bug bounty, whether it's one of the 10 different scanning tools we're using. Like, where do I go just to answer the question of like, where are all the vulnerabilities that I'm responsible for that impact my assets? So I think that's a big part of the problem. And that's a lot of what we focus on at Nucleus.
Yeah, I wanted to just quick comment before I turn it over to Chris. One of the things that we've talked about before too is this sort of complexity of security tooling and how many different products do you have in your environment, because it's everything from EDR, AV, everything that you're doing, anything threat intel. You have to sort of understand that implementing that many tools can actually add risk too. If you think about how many you're adding, what kind of access you're giving them, things like that. And that makes your vulnerability management program even more complex when you can simplify it and make it a little easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. If you just got, Qualys and you're living in their ecosystem of tooling, and that's all you're using, it's pretty simple. And I always say, like, vulnerability management with small businesses isn't very challenging or difficult, but as the enterprise grows, the complexity of the enterprise grows, so do the challenges with vulnerability management, right? Just kind of lockstep. The bigger the organization, the more complex it is. Yeah, the more tools they're using, the more teams they have and things like that. Yeah, the harder these things become, for sure.
Yeah, I love that path you guys were going down about the tool sprawl that's so prevalent in security. Is like, the tools themselves often have escalated privileges. Not only that, but it adds cognitive overload to the security team trying to manage all these tools, all the telemetry coming off of these tools. So I think that's a really critical point that doesn't get discussed enough. One thing I wanted to ask you about as well is, we all know, talked about vulnerability scoring, for example. We all know CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or at least most of us do if you've been in this space for some time. But many people argue, it's not enough, or it's not necessarily the right choice to use for, vulnerability prioritization in terms of exploitability, your unique environment, or unique threats to your environment, and you as an organization. Any thoughts around using other things like threat intelligence, things like that to drive some of your vulnerability management prioritization activities?
Oh yeah, lots of thoughts. This is another one we could talk about all day. I mean, first I'll say something unpopular, I guess, which, I think CVSS, we could probably all agree it's like widely misused, at least in terms of people using it for prioritization and to measure risk, because it's not what it was designed for. But having said that, I haven't given up hope with CVSS, and there, I don't know if you guys follow the CVSS working group, but they deserve more credit than they get, because they've been working hard, especially this last year, to on the next version of CVSS and improving it and addressing all these, issues and shortcomings, I think, that people have observed with CVSS, and ultimately, I think CVSS is going to become more useful over time. But it is just one, I think, input into a larger risk calculation, right? It's just kind of measuring that impact and that severity. So you need a lot more than that to figure out what to fix first and prioritize vulnerabilities, right? And I think you mentioned EPSS. That's a great one. Threat intelligence. So EPSS being another great tool, kind of like CVSS, though, in my opinion, it's one input into a bigger calculation and super unique. I mean, I'm guessing most of your audience probably already knows about EPSS and what it is and how useful it is. But to me, it's like another input into a risk calculation. Actually, on EPSS website, they give a good kind of breakdown of how you can use EPSS with CVSS, to help you come to risk decisions on things. But honestly, yeah. So threat intelligence is, in my mind, is really where it's at today. And unfortunately, there really aren't a ton of great free and open source, I guess, threat intelligence feeds. CISA Kev is out there. We've talked about that before, I think, in our last conversation. And so that's a great kind of free and open source feed. But yes, in my mind, answering the question of what's being exploited in the wild actively, which vulnerabilities are attackers focused on building exploits for? What do we have proof of concept code out there for in terms of exploitation, so that we know exploitation's coming with these vulnerabilities? That type of information, all threat and vuln intel type information, is what we recommend folks really rely on to make decisions about the highest risk vulnerabilities in their systems and networks.
Yeah, I agree. Using all those things to make a more informed decision is the best route to go. So you mentioned CISA a little bit there. I wanted to ask you about something you and I have chatted a little bit about, which is they had a post a while back from their executive director talking about the vulnerability management landscape. They talked about CSAF and VEX and SBOM, but they also brought up something called SSVC, which is a Stakeholder-Specific Vulnerability Categorization, which I gotta say, we are bad at acronyms, and that one doesn't really roll off the tongue. But so, tell us a little bit about SSVC that CISA has been evangelizing along with Carnegie Mellon. What is it? How can we use it, and why should we take a look at it?
Yeah, so SSVC, CVSS in reverse, for those out there in the audience that didn't catch that. But in my opinion, I think SSVC is probably one of the more underrated, I hate to call it a tool, but underrated concepts available today in vulnerability management. Not many folks really seem to know too much about it or understand it. And I attribute that to Carnegie Mellon. It was Carnegie Mellon's SEI, Software Engineering Institute, that developed SSVC. And these guys don't have a marketing team, right? So they're not putting the information out there. It's mostly, kind of academics writing this great content, and it's sitting out there available if you go and look for it. But, you're not going to see SSVC talked about a lot on LinkedIn and things like that. So a lot of people don't know about it. I think it's really underrated. But, but ultimately what it gives you, in my opinion, is one of the best approaches for determining which vulnerabilities to fix first in your organization. And it's not, I guess, the end all be all in terms of prioritization, in the sense that it doesn't help you to stack rank vulnerabilities, right? If you've got 1 million vulnerabilities or 100,000 vulnerabilities, it's not going to order those for you. But what it does help you do is pick the needles out of the haystack and really identify and make decisions about how to respond to those highest risk vulnerabilities in the organization, which, in my opinion, is really the most important thing to do. So, it's all based on this concept of decision trees, which is a simple, kind of straightforward concept, with the idea being that you define, what criteria, what attributes about a vulnerability would make it a critical risk vulnerability to your organization. And, hopefully you don't just say if it's a CVSS score of 9 or higher, right? We know that that's wrong, but maybe that's one input, right? Maybe it's CVSS is 9 or higher. Maybe it's, according to EPSS, it has a 50% chance or more of being exploited in the next 30 days. Maybe it's impacting a public facing asset. and on and on and on. And you get to define, all of these criteria and all this logic essentially that says, okay, if all these conditions are met, we're going to classify or categorize this as a critical risk vulnerability, and we're going to take this action. And so really all SSVC does is kind of give you that, that framework to define these things and then communicate that to the rest of the organization in a way that's, easily understood, I guess, and in a graphical way. So we like it a lot. We recommend it to a lot of the folks that we work with. It's just that, you don't hear too much about it. So I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah, I actually stumbled across SSVC when I was working on my dissertation because I found it as a really good reference for, other scoring methods, other ways that you can, actually try to identify what do these vulnerabilities mean to me. So I love it too. I think it's a great resource.
You stumbled across it. That was the key word, right?
Yes,
it wasn't just out there.
Yeah. Which and I'm glad I found it because it is a great resource. So for as we're talking about exploitability, right? And these additional sort of scoring methods that we have out there, there's the, we talked a little bit about the KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities sort of database or listing from CISA. So we have more focus, especially I think in 2022, on exploitability, right? What does exploitability mean to vulnerabilities? And in the hopes of, prioritizing, making sure that we're focusing on the vulnerabilities that can make the most impact to us. So do you feel like as an industry with vulnerability management, we're sort of headed in the right direction with things like EPSS and having the KEV now? And so do you feel like we're headed in the right direction? I know we're still missing some updated guidance and references, but as an industry, where do you think we are with vulnerability management?
100%, right? When you look at, where we wwere just 5 years ago or 6 years ago, no one was really talking about things like this, except, in the deep in security engineering teams and stuff like that. Now you see so much open conversation about it on LinkedIn. Now you've got tools like EPSS and CISA put out the KEV, which I think is amazing. So 100%, everything seems to be going in the right directions and more organizations, as a result, I think are starting to understand the importance of vulnerability management now, because I think it's one of those things that for a lot of enterprises, they set it up. Their whole management program was just something that was kind of stood up 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And it was very simple. And they just kind of added some stuff and some people to it over time, but there's never a ton of thought put into these things. And so now a lot of organizations are reevaluating everything like we were talking about before. And 100%, I think things are going in the right direction. I mean, I could go, CISA KEV, that's one that I love to talk about, all of the potential it has. I was sick over the holidays. I had COVID over the Christmas break, and I was tempted, actually started to write a blog post that was going to be titled, "All I Want for Christmas is CISA KEV Context," right? Because, they give you this list of vulns, they don't give you any other information. And so then I was like, I don't know. I don't want to piss anyone off over there. So I didn't, I nuked that project, but I was on a bunch of cold meds and stuff like that. So anyway, going in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, I think it's context is really important when it comes to vulnerabilities, because, a list of 3,000 or 10,000 vulnerabilities without context, it's hard to know where to start. It's a lot of information. And Chris mentioned, sort of mental workloads, cognitive overload, how much can a human being understand and extract? And so having that context is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've only, I think CISA KEV in particular, they're really the only real, what I call a threat intel feed. It's I don't know. It's dead simple, right? It's just a list of vulnerabilities, but it still answers the most important question, which vulnerabilities are being exploited in the wild right now. And it's the only source of that information that's maintained in that way, by a trusted organization that has the insight and the observability to maintain this list. So it's a great tool, and I hope that they add some of that context, because I think it's somewhere like, I don't know, it's something like 900 vulnerabilities now, but they don't tell you. Did they observe it exploited one time on an internal network? Did they observe it exploited thousands of times over the internet? Did they observe successful exploitation or failed attempts? Did they observe it 2 years ago? Was it yesterday? We don't know any of these, and it would be so powerful if they shared that. So hopefully this year is the year.
Yeah, another tool in the toolkit that you can use to help inform those risk-based decisions. So, so before I take us to our last question, our podcast last question, I wanted to ask you a little bit about if there's anything that you're working on, what Nucleus is doing, sort of what anything that you're working on that you wanted to share before I take us to our last question.
The biggest focus we have, one of the really big focuses we have at Nucleus this year is really on threat intelligence, like we talked about. I talked about the importance of it and how I feel about it being critical to really doing vulnerability management well. And so we're really leaning into that. And what we found is that a lot of large enterprises, especially, they already have they've already made big investments in threat intelligence. And all of these threat intelligence platforms have, a vuln intel component to them, right? That's threat intelligence kind of is about this wide, and there's about this much that's kind of vulnerability intelligence, what we call vulnerability intelligence. So we're very much focused on looking at across all of the intelligence that our customers already have already invested in and integrate into their enterprise, and extracting the vulnerability intelligence kind of value from those feeds, right? So whether it's we bake vulnerability intelligence into our platform as well. But if a customer comes to us and they've got a Flashpoint or Recorded Future or Intel 471 or any of these other feeds, we're really interested in maximizing the value of those investments they've already made and using them for vuln intel or for vuln management workflows and use cases. So that's kind of one of the really big focuses for the year.
Awesome. Great. Okay. So that'll take us to our final question we ask everyone. And I'm very curious about your insight with your background as a developer and your work in the vulnerability management space. So what does cyber resiliency mean to you?
Oh man. This is a surprise question, Nikki. I didn't know you were going to ask this.
Yes.
Oh, cyber resiliency. So it's funny, this is a term that I didn't hear much of at all until maybe a couple of years ago. And even today, it doesn't come up a ton in conversation, but I think of it as obviously, a very, very broad concept. And it's the concept of being able to withstand, any kind of attack against confidentiality, against integrity, against availability, and being able to be resilient, in spite of all of the threats and all the risks and everything else. So I know that's not anything profound or really interesting.
No, that's perfect.
That's kind of how I think about it.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. Well, I can't thank you enough for kicking off season 4 for us for the new year for 2023. Thank you for being here and talking to us all things vulnerability management, threat intelligence, exploitability. If anybody's looking, they can find you on LinkedIn. We posted the website for Nucleus if you want to check it out. So thanks again for being here, and we'll see everybody next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I had a blast. Take care.